Okay, so the final presentation is fairly short. It's only going to be 7 or 8 slides. It's going to talk a little bit about the policies and safeguards you can put in place to provide yourselves some assurance that the reserves and resource information that companies are supplying to you is reasonable. I'm basically going to talk from highest level of confidence to basically much more uncertain but high-level checks you can do on reserves and resource information. And this is basically graded based on what we see public companies and private companies implementing. So generally accepted as the best practices approach in Canada, the US, and many other parts of the world is the independent qualified reserves evaluators and auditors. It's strongly recommended by COGI and mandated by Untitled 101, as we've talked about before. There's no requirement on SEC for independence, but most of the companies listed on the New York Stock Exchange still use IQRAs and IQRAs, and that's simply because it's a good way to provide internal controls and quality assurance in their reserves process. So they're not required to do it. It is incremental expense to the company, but the board of directors in many public companies mandate they do it anyways as due diligence on their reserves and resource volumes. So the benefits of the IQRE or IQRA approach are that it ensures evaluations are estimated or audited in an unbiased and objective manner. It also ensures that the people who are actually doing the evaluations have adequate experience and credentials, because part of the requirements of an IQRE is certifying that they are qualified. Disadvantages of this approach: companies may not want to incur additional costs associated with independent consultants. We deal with that all the time. It is incremental cost, no question. And it may be unnecessary if appropriate corporate policies and controls are in place in the company. So again, I would point back to the very large E&P companies in the world that have very strong internal processes and controls. The ones that are exempt from NI, from SEC independence, the ones that generally don't use independent qualified evaluators, mandating them for companies like that would be a mistake, because it would just be unnecessary. Sort of the second level is external audits or reviews. So this would be the approach that the regulators take in Canada and the US. This is the ASC, the Alberta Securities Commission, or the Canadian Securities Administrators, going through disclosure guidance. They have qualified evaluators and auditors on staff who are very familiar with evaluations, and they go through the reports and sort of do high-level checks and look for irregularities and anomalies in the reports. So for an organization like MRPAM or the government of Mongolia, training some of your people to understand how to evaluate and analyze the data provided by companies and the evaluations provided by companies would probably be a worthwhile initiative. So the benefits of this approach: it provides independent oversight on evaluation results, so it's not part of the evaluation process, but you're at least getting an independent review of the disclosure. And it ensures that the government or regulator is involved and informed. So if you have people on staff that understand how to evaluate oil and gas assets and are going through the disclosures of the various companies that are disclosing their volumes to you, it helps to increase the understanding and the level of commitment that the regulator or the government has in the asset base of the country. Disadvantages: it's labor intensive and requires significant training and expertise. So in order to get qualified reserves evaluators and auditors on your staff, you have to do a significant amount of evaluations training to make sure that the people who are looking at these disclosures are qualified to make the call on whether they're reasonable or not. High-level simple check is just compliance with recognized standards. So that's what we've been talking about the last 2 days now. PRMS, COGI. If a company certifies that their evaluation has been conducted in compliance with some of these more rigorous standards, it gives you an additional level of comfort that the standards are being met and the volumes are likely reasonable. So this really, I mean, you always run the risk of a company saying they're compliant with the guidance, but not actually being up to snuff on, or being up to par on the evaluation standards. But the benefits, it requires minimal resources and oversight. This is mandating, once you put the legislation in place to regulate based on and mandate that companies have to disclose based on these standards, there's no additional requirements. You basically, as long as the company is certifying that their evaluation has been done in accordance with those standards, you're done. It's widely recognized that this goes from internal inside of companies, NOCs, up to public disclosure. This is sort of the first step in a lot of systems for ensuring that reserves and resource volumes are reasonable. Disadvantage. We talked a little bit about, when I was talking about coding and PRMS, there is gray areas in a lot of the guidance that provide flexibility for how evaluators can deal with specific situations. And that flexibility can cause inconsistencies. So companies could certify that they're in compliance with the standards, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's been done to the level of acceptance that you might expect as a regulator or as a government. It's also lacking independent review. So like I said, people can tell you that they're doing it in accordance with certain standards, but unless you've actually done some verifications, they may or may not actually be in accordance. This is going back to the very large companies, again, internal policies and quality controls. So under SEC and NI 5111, one of the disclosures that they mandate is a discussion on internal policies and controls that companies have on their reserves evaluators and processes. Things like reserves committees comprise of independent board members, comprehensive best practices, procedures, and guidance, etc. These are all things that will give you an additional level of comfort with the volumes that are being provided. And as I've said a number of times, very large companies have strong internal policies to protect themselves as much as investors and other stakeholders. Again, one of the benefits, there's no real work on your side of the fence other than telling people that you need to be disclosing your internal policies and having someone review those internal policies to make sure they're in the best practices realm. Disadvantages is that it's company specific. If you have a very small company that has very limited internal controls, and again, similar to certifying compliance, policy and controls can be there, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all the evaluators and or auditors in the company are going to comply with those internal policies. The final slide, annual reconciliation. So whenever the ASC or the SEC is going through reserves reports, this is their first stop. They're always looking at the reconciliations first for major changes in reserves, major shifts year over year, and trends over the longer term may improve probable and possible volumes. So as we've talked about a couple of times, 1P revision should be positive the vast majority of the time, 2P should be neutral, and 3P should be negative. Volume should be coming down over time. Again, it requires minimal resources and oversight. It's not that hard to take a look at an annual basis on the performance of the numbers. Disadvantages, it's very rough, high level. There's a long lead time before problems may be identified, so it may be 2, 3, 4 years before a company actually has to reconcile major issues. A lot of times companies, when well performance or field performance isn't going as expected, there will be some leniency in the short term where they say, okay, we're not meeting expectations right now, but we're going to maintain or relatively maintain our levels of volumes until we have more certainty that we are off base. So it might be a couple of years before you start to see big write-downs or revisions upwards. And if the company's internal practices are flawed, the reconciliations aren't going to provide any useful feedback. So if the evaluations aren't being done correctly, there's nothing stopping them from continuing poor practices, and therefore your reconciliation isn't going to give you any useful data, because they're going to be making the same mistakes or have the same issues year over year. So that's just 5 or 6 methods for providing some assurance that the volumes that are being disclosed are reasonable. There's more specific guidance as to what you would look for in reserves disclosure. Certain red flags, for example, one of the quickest checks that most regulators will do is they'll go through the undeveloped bookings and they'll look at the undeveloped bookings per well in an area, and they'll compare it to the producing wells in an area. And if the undeveloped type curve, if the undeveloped bookings per well are higher than the average or even the best producing wells, that's an immediate red flag that they're probably overestimating their undeveloped reserves. So there's a whole bunch of, again, high-level, very quick checks that, especially in Canada and the US, because the disclosure is so comprehensive, you can run through an AIF and there's about 7 or 8 high-level checks that you can do very quickly to see if the company reserves are performing in a way that you would expect.